We're running on fumes down here. Yesterday, a 16-hour Animal Day marathon at Buffalo Wild Wings. Station did appreciate all the support help from the people here at B-Dubs, our sponsors, the engineers, promotion staff, and, of course, met with a lot of listeners. That was fun for people who were able to make it in here to B-Dubs and got out in the streets there a little bit. So do appreciate all the support we have here. And what a day for Detroit. Now, today could be just as special. I want to get to the Mel Mock, and I promised it, but I think we need to run down all of the players. I'm gonna give you guys, Kang, you and Gator, and we'll kind of talk about each player that might be available and how excited we would be, because I don't suspect very many will get to 61, but I suspect one or two will, because this list is kind of deep of players that could help Detroit that are still out there. They're 29 picks away. We'll start with defensive tackle Jer'Jon Newton. He might be the most attractive player left on the board and at a position of need. Good player. A lot of people thought he was a first rounder. I think circumstance kept him out of the first round, but he seems to me like a player that could really help Detroit, Scott.
He would, but I expect him to go pretty early. I know one of the ESPN analysts has him as the second best player available on day 2. So I wouldn't expect him to be around, but absolutely, this is a guy we talked about yesterday in the first round. Would you want him at 29? And there's plenty of reason to want him at 29. And, you know, if you're looking already ahead, unfortunately, one of the problems of having a really good team with really good players is that you have tough decisions to make. If you can't bring Aleem McNeil back, you're going to have to start thinking about a replacement, because Aleem McNeil is likely to command a salary in excess of $20 million a season after this year. You got to start thinking about replacing him.
Kang, I want to bring this up to you specifically, because this was your guy yesterday. If this draft starts unfolding and we get through the 30s and Jer'Jon Newton hasn't been taken, and we get through the 40s and he's not been taken, and we're in the early 50s, do you consider going all in and saying, F it, we're going to get our second guy, the second guy that can help us defensively, and give up more picks and just say top heavy, we're going for it now? These are two players that we think can play for us, make plays next year, and start for us. Would you consider a trade up and give up even more draft capital?
Doug, I'm willing to give up the rest of the draft to go up and get him in the 30s. I'm not kidding. So if he were there at 61 or whatever, of course, I don't even screw the NFL rules on waiting, just get the pick in. But he's not going to be there. And, Gator mentioned it, that he's one of the most highly, if not the most rated player left that hasn't been picked. So I expect him to go in the 30s. I would definitely think about strongly giving up the rest of my draft to go get him, because I think he is, if you use a 3-man rotation, he's a day one type guy. He's a disruptor. I think that highly of him. And even if you bring back Aleem McNeil, DJ Reader is on a 2-year deal. He's a vet. And if your future is Aleem McNeil and Johnny Newton, your future is really good.
Okay, Braden Fisk out of Florida State is probably the next defensive tackle that is still available. More likely, I would think that he'd be on the board at 61, although I also still think more likely than Jer'Jon Newton, but also unlikely.
I would tend to agree with you. Probably unlikely, just because there weren't that many defensive players that went last night. I wanted to ask you, Doug, specifically about a guy that you saw in kind of comparison, because you saw Johnny Newton play a lot.
Yep.
Kind of compare and contrast that to Chris Jenkins.
Like Johnny Newton better. Chris Jenkins, good player. Good player.
Chris Jenkins from Michigan.
Defensive tackle. He's not a high stat guy. He's kind of does the dirty work. I think between Newton and Fisk, maybe a little bit more ability to get home to the quarterback. But if Chris Jenkins is the pick at 42, or excuse me, at 61, that's not particularly disappointing.
Okay, and then I guess with the 3 defensive tackles Michigan had, the other 2 coming back with Grant and Graham.
Yep.
Where does Jenkins rate with those in that trio?
3rd.
Okay.
Yep.
So those guys both higher end.
I would say so, yeah. Another couple names to watch at that position, Mason Smith at LSU. Tavondre Sweat, if you really got to do your homework, this is a guy that an awful decision, a driving while intoxicated charge 2 weeks ago. Terrible timing for a player that some thought might go in the first round. All right, still on the board. Zach Frazier, West Virginia, interior offensive line. I don't know that I could think of a player that the Lions would want more than him. Again, is there a chance he makes it to 61? Seems unlikely, but he's still out there.
Well, he and Jackson Powers Johnson.
Yeah.
Both of those guys, interior offensive linemen, Is one more of a center than the other one? I mean, the versatility, again, is something that the Lions covet. And it's just adding to that pool of players. You want a mauler? You want a guy who's going to fight for it? I have no issue if they take an interior offensive lineman. And kind of hoping that one of those guys is there for him at 61, but it doesn't seem likely, but you never know.
Throwing Cooper Beebe, Kang, the interior offensive lineman, Frazier, Jackson Powers, Johnson, Cooper Beebe. Could one of them be there at 61, and do you think they would jump?
I would love any of those guys. For me, it's Johnny Newton, and there's a huge gap between the next DT and him. So if Johnny Newton's not available, I go right to the interior offensive line, and any of those guys would be a dream for me.
Some depth there, so it's possible that one of them could be on the board. Edge rushers, 2 guys, I think at 61 make a ton of sense. Marshawn Nealand out of Western Michigan, Chris Braswell out of Alabama. Nealand would be really a cool story, but also, I think he could be a guy that secretly could really just come in here and make an impact next year.
Yeah, and Braswell's a guy, wasn't he hurt a couple years ago? And then kind of came back, and he had really high hopes for him as a player, but kind of eased his way back and started playing better as the year went on. I tend to subscribe to the theory you can't go wrong with Alabama players early in the draft.
Next up, the wide receiver position. A lot of players here. Keon Coleman, Adonai Mitchell, Lab McConkey, and Jalen Polk.
Well, a couple of those guys I think are going to be off the board right away with the first 2 picks in the draft. We have Buffalo, and Buffalo passed on a number of receivers. They traded back twice. I love what Buffalo did.
Yeah.
To trade back a second time, just getting more draft capital, and you could end up still getting. I imagine that the reason they did it is because they're like, wait a minute, we can trade back and still get like Keon Coleman. Beautiful for them. And I forget who's got the second pick of the round, but it looks like that's another receiver possibility. But there's still lots of really good receivers out there. You mentioned Polk, McMillan, his teammate as well from Washington. You got Roman Wilson from Michigan. There's a bunch of receivers that are still out there that you look at. If you want to take one in the second round, maybe you can. Maybe I don't know if you want to roll the dice and wait till the 5th round. Is that the next pick the Lions have?
Yeah.
So unless they're able to acquire some more draft capital, guys like Malachi Corley, they're probably not going to be available to him.
The second pick, by the way, goes to the New England Patriots.
Yeah.
The safety spot, Javon Bullard, Tyler. Oh, Kang, your thoughts on the wide receivers? Any of those guys get to 61? Are you jumping?
I think they could because, and I would jump because as much as of an offensive, round 1 heavy it was, I think round 2 could be defensive heavy because of all the great players that are left and no one took a defensive player. So I think one of those receivers could slip to the Lions, and they have a need there with Josh Reynolds being gone.
Okay, let's get to the safety spot. Javon Bullard out of Georgia, Tyler Nubin out of Minnesota. Either of those players, and I like Bullard better than Nubin, but either of those players, that's kind of a secret need of the Lions. It's down the list, but I would like to see them get another safety.
Yeah, another one that consideration, Cole Bishop from Utah is highly rated as well. Safety is a position that they need to upgrade, but I think they can do that through free agency. There's still some guys that are there. Quandre Diggs, former Detroit Lion, still there. And Jamal Adams, I think, is still available as well. So I'd rather them go that route, get a guy on a 1-year deal, a 2-year deal for cheap, and get them there.
And then, Gator, this is one of your favorites. He's still on the board. The offensive tackle from BYU, Kingsley Suamataia. He could, he's Penei Sewell's cousin, right?
Exactly. Yeah, he's still there, a tackle, and the Lions will have a need to replace a tackle, I would imagine, soon. I mean, that's another one of these tough decisions. What happens with Taylor Decker? Taylor Decker, if he's going to stay with the Lions, they can't pay him like a starting left tackle in the league. They just can't afford to do that after they've paid Penei Sewell and Amon-Ra St. Brown and likely to pay Jared Goff and others here. So I think you have to start thinking about it, and that's a guy I really like.
So that's a list. I think that's 14 names. We went over a few more than that. So, the Lions 29 picks away. Can they get a guy that you covet? Well, believe it or not, Gator, of all the names we just mentioned, there are a couple of them that are on the board for the Lions in Mel's mock.
Oh, I
for
like
the second round.
I like it.